Census had one simple purpose: to find out how many young men might be found fit for military service. Well, nowadays, every 10 years, it's become a way of finding some facts to help planners, politicians and the rest of us make sense of our country. The England and Wales census published today shows more of us are atheists, more born abroad, and perhaps the most politically charged point, more of us find the dream of owning our own home impossible to achieve. We'll hear what the facts and figures mean for our daily lives in a moment. First, here's Jim Reid with the key points.
This is the story of the decade. From the end of New Labour to days and dates we will never forget. From winning the Olympics to economic meltdown. From a national celebration to riots on the streets of our biggest cities. The latest census shows beyond any doubt we are now in the middle of an astonishing era of demographic change. Some of our high streets now look very different, unrecognisable even, from the same streets a decade ago. That picture is being changed dramatically by migration. Just 1 in 6 of the people who live here in East London now describe themselves as white British. The same trend is happening to a lesser extent in towns and cities across England and Wales. Overall, this is becoming a more populated and far more diverse country. A series of regional maps published today show in detail how this is happening. Take religion. In 2001, more than 3/4 of the population in large swathes of England and Wales described themselves as Christian. 10 years later, that number has fallen sharply, replaced largely by a rising people who say they have no religion at all, up from 15% to 25%. The most visible change, though, has been in the ethnic makeup of many of our towns and cities. The number describing themselves as white fell below 90% for the first time. 1 in 8 households is now made up of people from more than one ethnic group. There are, though, wide regional variations. The capital is the only region where the group described as white British is now in a minority, at 45% for the first time since records began. Overall, the number of foreign-born citizens has increased from 4.5 million to 7.5 million over the decade. The number of Poles has gone from just 58,000 back in 2001 to more than 500,000 10 years later.
When we look at the overall foreign-born population, we see that 40% are living in London, according to these figures. For the Polish-born population, it's actually only 27%, so nearly 3/4 of Polish-born people in England and Wales are actually outside of London. And so this means that they're living in areas that have experienced less migration in the past, which has significant implications for the way the country has experienced migration in the past decade.
Then there is the impact of economic change on our society. At a time when the number of people living in big cities like London and Manchester has been rising, some industrial towns in the northwest have seen a sharp fall in their populations. And the regional breakdown also illustrates a change in our work patterns. This map shows how the number of people in a part-time job has risen between 2001 and 10 years later in 2011, a sharp increase in almost every part of England and Wales. And there has been a big shift in where and how we live. Fewer of us are married than a decade ago, and for the first time more people say they have a degree than have no qualification. The figures show a significant rise in the number of people who rent their home from a private landlord, up from 9% 10 years ago to 15%, and, as you might expect, a drop in the proportion who pay a mortgage, from 39% down to 33%. It's the first fall in home ownership since records began 6 decades ago.
That's a really rapid increase in private renting. It's a really stark drop in the number of people who've got mortgages, and it is kind of moving us back in time to a time when, I mean, there was a time when the majority of the population rented privately, and it's moving us back over who is going to end up owning their own home. And that, seeing the speed of that change, that was the biggest shock for me this morning, looking at the numbers that came in.
The rise in part-time working, the increase in private renting, are perhaps more to do with the economy at the moment than any major changing trend in society. Even so, there are big implications in this data for areas like housing, health and social care policy. When we look back at the decade though, it may well be that it's remembered not just for the credit crunch, nor winning the Olympics, nor coalition government. Instead, it may be the time when our country suddenly became a much more diverse place to live.
Jim Reid, well, interesting though all this is, does it actually matter? Well, Daniel Knowles is the Britain correspondent of The Economist and has been